There are a lot of choices in the ultra-wide zoom category for Sony full-frame E-mounts, and while the Sigma 16-28 f2.8 DGDN Contemporary might not be the sexiest or most exciting lens you'll ever buy, it might be one of the best values. Obviously, this lens is available for Sony E-mount. We're taking a look at it here on the Sony a7 IV and the a7S III, but it's also available for the L mount. So if you have been eyeing one of those new Lumix S5 Mark IIs and a wide-angle lens, then this video is relevant for you too. These are my impressions of using this lens after a few months for real estate photography and videography, and using it for some B-roll in YouTube videos, and just taking it out for fun and shooting some photos. I am shooting the video on the lens currently, and I obviously wanted to give you an idea of how it would work in a situation like this. I'm using the a7 IV, and I have the lens set to 20 millimeters at f2.8, but I'm shooting in the Super 35 crop mode on the a7 IV, so it's not super wide. A 16-35 f2.8 or f4 would be the more traditional lens in this category, but what's really cool about Sigma and Tamron is they are offering some more budget-oriented options that kind of fill out the same ranges that you would get in the holy triumvirate of zoom lenses, that being the 16-35, 24-70, and 70-200. So instead of a 16-35 here, you obviously have a 16-28 f2.8, and Tamron also has a 17-28 f2.8. So is 16-28 a good compromise, or should you save up a little bit of extra money and try to get one of the 16-35 f2.8s that are available? What do you get for the 16-28? Obviously, it's a lot cheaper. I think this lens retails for somewhere around $900 in comparison with the 16-35 f2.8, which is going to be well over $1,000, if not $2,000 for some options. It's also a lot smaller and lighter than a 16-35 f2.8 would be. That's pretty much it. What's important to me for an ultra wide is the wide end. It's much more noticeable, the difference between, say, 16 and 20 millimeters, or 16 and even 18 millimeters, than 28 and 35. And if you do pair it with a camera like the a7 IV, which has a 4K Super 35 mode, then you can extend the reach beyond 35 millimeters and still get a really nice image out of it. So I think that a 16-28 is a pretty good compromise. For the use case that I primarily intended to use this lens for real estate video and photography, you don't really need the 35 millimeter. The wide end is much more important. The lens has 9 rounded aperture blades, a minimum focusing distance of 9.9 inches or 25 centimeters. And remember, with minimum focusing distance, that's from the sensor to the object and not the front of the lens to the object. The front filter diameter is 72 millimeters. The lens weighs 450 grams or 15.9 ounces. As for image quality, I'll just give you the example photos and videos, and you can make a determination. I'm not going to do any, testing or charts or anything like that. So it's all real world examples. For real estate, it is perfectly acceptable. It's way sharp enough. Even if it's not the sharpest option in this category, it definitely serves that purpose. When you're talking about real estate photography, they're going to the MLS website, and I think that the maximum file size for those photos is like 10 megabytes. You're not going to have a massive file that somebody can punch in and peek around and check out all the details. Lens corrections within the camera are doing a lot of heavy lifting to correct for barrel and pincushion distortion, which this lens does have a lot of, which isn't uncommon. I feel like all lenses these days are using software corrections. There's some focus breathing on this lens, and being a third-party lens, it's not compatible with the focus breathing compensation in the Sony Alpha cameras that have that feature. On the plus side, this lens appears to be parfocal, which I wasn't really expecting, and that means as you zoom in and out, it will maintain focus. You can see in the main talking head section of this video that there is a little bit of a lens flare happening, that the lens is catching the key light, but there's no real loss of contrast, which is really nice. And you can see in the B-roll here, some little flaring artifacts happening, but again, no loss of contrast. So I would say in these real world examples that flaring is well controlled in this lens. And it does come with this lens hood, which I forgot to mention earlier. It's just a typical pedal style hood, which, isn't going to do a whole lot, but it might help in certain situations knock back some flaring if you want. I forgot to mention that this seems to have a linear focus throw, which is different from a lot of other lenses for Sony E-mount, which have an acceleration-based focus. And linear focus is much preferable, in my opinion anyway, for video shooters. As for autofocus, I think these are using Sigma stepping motors, so they're probably not as advanced as the linear motors that Sony has been using, and I think Tamron as well. The autofocus performance is still pretty good. For photography, it's extremely snappy, extremely fast and accurate. It seems to be a little bit worse, I think, than some of the Sony lenses that I have and have used in the past, but I don't think it's going to be anything that would be a deal breaker for this lens. Now, the contemporary lens lineup from Sigma is, again, the more budget-oriented lens lineup in comparison to their art lens series. So this is the 24-70 DGDN art for Sony E-mounts. You will notice in comparison to an art lens that the build quality and the feature set of the lens itself isn't quite as nice. The lens is noticeably plastic. It does have, of course, a metal lens mount, and it has a gasket on the back to help with weather sealing, but Sigma doesn't claim that it's, weather sealed or weatherproof to the same degree as an art lens, for instance. I managed to get caught out in the storm with the lens, and it held up perfectly fine. There is, on the zoom ring, it has a rubber finish to it, so it feels nice, just like the art lens, but the focus ring is kind of a soft plastic, so that's different from the art lens, which is rubber as well. And the only switch on the contemporary lens is the autofocus manual focus switch, so it doesn't have a programmable focus hold button on it, nor does it have like the little zoom lock that you get on this art lens, for instance. One really nice thing about it, especially if you compare it to even the Sony 16-35 G Master, is that it is an internally zooming lens. So in comparison to this 24-70, which you can see, what do you call this? The barrel extends from the body of the lens. That lens does not. It's great because you can balance the lens on a gimbal and you can change the focal length and not throw off the balance. And also having a lens like this, which barrels out, there's a potential of it, getting dust and particles within the lens barrel and kind of working their way through the elements and stuff, which is never a good thing. If you don't shoot real estate, what else is this lens good for? It would make a really great vlogging lens. Obviously, 16 is perfectly wide enough for that. I mean, you could go all the way to 24 and have a decent focal length for filming yourself. Street photography and street videography, just casual photography. This is a great walk-around lens. It's a little bit limited on the long end, again, at only 28 millimeters, but 28 millimeters is still a very natural field of view. I'm a really big fan of wide-angle lenses. I think it gives you a very dramatic point of view. So if you do a lot of like action-y kind of things, having an ultra-wide, it's kind of like a GoPro, but you get a much better image quality out of a big full-frame sensor paired with an ultra-wide angle lens than you would out of a GoPro. Now, everybody says that you should get maybe a 50 or an 85 millimeter for shooting B-roll so you can isolate details of objects and blur out the background. And I think that's true. But I think an ultra-wide is often overlooked for B-roll because you can put the camera right in the midst of the thing that you're filming and get a very different point of view or perspective than you would with a long lens, which is kind of like, poaching. Poaching, is that a good word? Seems kind of violent. Spying, no. Peeping. Anyway, a long lens that is obviously zoomed in on an object from further away. It just had a very noticeably different perspective. And it's something that I don't think people take advantage enough of, especially when you have a wide-angle lens that has a pretty good close focusing distance. So to wrap it up, I feel like this is a really great lens for the price. I wish it were a 16-35, but again, there's trade-offs. Anytime you get a 16-35 f2.8, it's going to be bigger, heavier, and more expensive. So you have to make that determination. Is the trade-off worth it to you? And for the ultra-wide category, I feel like having a really quality, wide, super wide lens is more important than one that can reach out to 35 millimeters because you have that covered potentially, or it's really easy to get 35 and beyond covered in a lot of different ways.